Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of our director, Professor Audrey Kirk-Cronin, I want to welcome you to the final installment of our Scientists and Strategists series this semester. I'm Ralph Lopez, the Deputy Director for Security Policy Studies here at the Carnegie Mellon Institute for Strategy and Technology, or CMIST for short. At CMIST, we focus on the development, risks, and opportunities of emerging technologies that are reshaping the landscape of war and peace. This speaker series brings CMU scientists and engineers together with national and international strategists and policymakers for in-person discussions that bridge the gap between technology and strategy. By introducing scientists and strategists together, we enrich our understanding of groundbreaking research while highlighting the strategic implications of today's fast-evolving technologies. Over the course of this series, we've explored topics ranging from nuclear deterrence and the role of technology firms in geopolitics, to women in STEM, civil-military relations, and the rise of edge computing. Today, we turn to one of the defining strategic and technological competitions of the 21st century, artificial intelligence. As the United States and China pursue fundamentally different models of AI innovation, one grounded in market dynamics, open research, and democratic values, the other driven by state direction, industrial coordination, and military civil fusion. The consequences reach far beyond technical capability. These approaches are shaping not only global economics and military competition, but also the norms, governance, and trust frameworks that will determine how societies harness AI in the decades ahead. Our conversation will examine how political systems, institutional structures, and governance regimes shape AI development, how each model's strengths and vulnerabilities affect military modernization and economic resilience, and what policy frameworks might help preserve democratic technological leadership while fostering responsible global cooperation. We're fortunate to be joined by two exceptional experts in the field. Mr. John Costello is a non-resident fellow at CMIST and a veteran national security leader who has served across both the Trump and Biden administrations. He was the first chief of staff of the Office of the National Cyber Director at the White House, the first new executive office created since 1988, and previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Intelligence and Security. A U.S. Navy veteran and former intelligence analyst at the National Security Agency, John helped lead the Cyberspace Solarium Commission's work on cybersecurity, resilience, and supply chain security. He holds a BA from the University of Maryland University College and graduated with honors from the Defense Language Institute and is fluent in Chinese Mandarin. Dr. Thomas Serban van de Veer is a CMIST faculty affiliate and an artificial intelligence research scientist with Carnegie Mellon Software Engineering Institute, where he studies frontier AI systems, open source large language models, and international AI development trends. A member of SEI's Frontier Lab, Tomas has collaborated with the Oxford Center for Technology and Development as a specialist in artificial intelligence. He holds a DPhil in computer science from the University of Oxford, a master's in human-computer interaction from our own Carnegie Mellon University, and a BS in psychology and human-computer interaction also from CMU. Our format this evening will include presentations, first from John and then Tomas. Next, I'll sit down with both of them for a lively Q&A, and finally, we'll wrap up with questions from the audience. So now, if you will, please welcome John Costello to the podium.
Thank you so much. Let me pull up my notes here. I flew in from DC yesterday. Boy, my arm's tired. Heard that was a good icebreaker. It's great to be here with Dr. Van Davier. and to be here with all of you. CMIST, really appreciate it, and thank you again, Colonel. I really appreciate the introduction. What I'm going to do is give you guys today a clear, grounded look at how China's approach to AI development actually works, what advantages it gives Beijing, where it creates real constraints, and what this means when you contrast it with how we would characterize development in the United States. A lot of popular commentary treats US-China AI competition as if it were a linear race of compute curves, benchmark scores, or model sizes. But AI obviously is not a single race. It's a complex ecosystem. Tomas is going to get into a little bit more of the technical specifics of that in a moment. But it is a system-level phenomenon. It's shaped just as much by governance, institutional design, and political incentives created in each, geopolitical incentives created by each of their countries as it is the technology that is involved. Today we're going to walk through China's directed development approach, how it differs from the US, what we would call democratic innovation model, and why these differences create very specific strengths and very specific vulnerabilities. Okay, next slide. So, China's state-directed model, if you would call it state-directed, can really be split into sort of three layers. At the top is the political leadership, the political strategy, and that is filtered down to ministries, SOEs, provinces, and that hits firms and labs. Now, it's important to think of this as these top level incentives are, they frame AI as a strategic technology, a tool for domestic governance, a pillar of national competitiveness. The laws, the policies that are created by the Chinese Communist Party create a political alignment, where when top leadership signals AI for manufacturing, upgrading, or AI for social governance, institutions across the board fall in line. Good example is the 14th five-year plans. The five-year plans that come out every party Congress is perhaps the best bellwether and the best indices for Chinese economic objectives, strategic objectives, and their own conception of their vulnerability and their strength and where they need to develop. Defense white papers also emphasize AI as, the moving towards intelligentized warfare as a future objective, a Zhernanghua Zhanzheng or a Xinxihua Zhanzheng. This has been a slow evolution of a Chinese conception of information-centric or network-centric warfare from the 90s that has coincided with their technological and infrastructure development as a country. And then finally, you see things like provinces, following suit in declaring AI industrial clusters to attract central subsidies and further government funding. Secondly, it's important to understand that at least from a broad perspective, Chinese push towards development is it's an institutional direction. It's not micromanagement. Underneath the sort of political layer is a landscape of ministries, regulators, provinces, SOEs, labs, national champions, and commercial enterprises. So Beijing will set the direction, but the system still requires bargaining and competition. They'll use instruments like the S&T mega projects, ministry-level guidance funds, subsidies for AI parks and pilot zones, standard-setting bodies from the Ministry of Informatization and CAC, or the Cyberspace Administration of China, and government procurement certainly as a market-shaping tool. Their use of government procurement and procurement guidelines, I will admit, having done a sort of exhaustive comparison with the U.S., tends to be more consistent and more of a monolithic tool than the U.S. I think wishes it had a lot of the time. Firms. When we get down to the sort of lowest level, firms and labs. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of the term military-civil fusion. Military-civil fusion is an incredibly misunderstood concept. It guarantees access and support. It does not necessarily guarantee sort of complicity or cooperation. I think a lot in the Western media would characterize military-civil fusion of that as if the PLA calls Alibaba and says, we want you to do something, Alibaba has to do it. I would submit to say that, like, I think most countries, if the military, if there's a legitimate authority or power is calling a firm to do something, and they have the authority to do that, they're probably going to do that thing. But it's characterized, I think, in terms that are not particularly helpful. What it ultimately means here is in the academic community, commercial communities, military communities, individual researchers can file patents together, they can conduct research together, they can conduct and start businesses together. Some of the ethical boundaries or organizational boundaries that we would conceive of or we would view as in ethical conflict are not necessarily viewed the same in certain portions in China if the overall objective and incentives are aligned with what benefits the state. Now, that is a lot of mealy-mouthing conception of, well, you know, is that false equivalence? I don't think so. That's how the Chinese would describe it. Is a system that intentionally looks to break down barriers between institutions that could have wildly different incentives. Could that lead to corruption? Sure, it could lead to corruption anywhere. But I think it's important that we understand what military-civil fusion is, what it is not, and how the Chinese view that as a massive engine of growth. Because a lot of the innovation that we see, in the Chinese ecosystem comes from these military-civil fusion networks. And they continue to be a central driving force of the rapid development and ultimately commercialization of new technologies. So, I mean, it's broadly speaking, this isn't sort of Soviet-style central management, right? It's not this, checking boxes and sending inspectors. It tends to be far more. Beijing is setting the vector, and then you have a ecosystem, a very large state apparatus, and a very large politically accountable commercial apparatus that is competing underneath that framework. So there are elements of innovation. Okay. So let's talk about the strengths of the Chinese model. So number one is in applications of new technologies. The Chinese model is particularly good at the commercialization and application of new technologies. State-level policy works very well in setting a standard and requiring a standard using state-level funds, either through procurement or setting benchmarks for municipalities to implement and to upgrade infrastructure and to apply new technologies quickly. There's automatic buy-in, politically and oftentimes commercially. China has a very, very vibrant industrial sector and a very, very vibrant private capital ecosystem. So they find ready and willing funding, manufacturing, and customers. If there's a state-level directive saying we will upgrade, we'll increase and modernize our infrastructure. This isn't a pivot for a lot of portions of China. This is consistent and just an acceleration of their existing infrastructure level build-out and growth. Second is integration across government and industry. Again, this is a sort of military-civil fusion. State companies or state elements working with private sector companies is obviously happens frequently. There's a lot more shared data. There's a lot fewer barriers between sharing data between the Chinese government and Chinese commercial enterprises. So there tends to be a little bit more bleed over, I think, between development of commercial or innovative technologies and their application or use, even in a testing environment by government agencies and government bureaucracies. So finally is sort of high volume data and permissive environments. So China has a vast operational sort of data sets. And this has been talked about before. What does your national database base look like? They have tons of data sets generated by municipal surveillance, telecom carriers, online platforms like WeChat or Taobao, which are tied directly into state media or state-owned media like Xinhua, and then state-owned enterprises handling electricity, transport, and logistics. to govern these, to keep track of these, to keep track of these things at a scale that a country of 1.4 billion people needs, it runs on data. That data is collected, the data is aggregated, and that data is incredibly useful and serves as a massive database for China to be able to empower and create models and to leverage the data that those models can utilize. Regulations allow for broad aggregation, fewer consent requirements, and shorter approval cycles. This fuels a lot of, I would say, logistical and practical problems China envisions. So national recommender systems, stress, emotion, voice models for sentiment analysis of people, logistics optimization and transportation optimization, and predictive policing algorithms as well. And we've seen this, the next one, major sort of advantage here is also in vertical integration of hardware and software. And we've seen this not only, we've seen the best example of this is, for instance, the elements of telecom. We've seen integrated vertical vendor lock as through Huawei, for instance, implementing, like putting in 3G architecture and then, making it cheaper and having a better service model for integration of 4G or 5G architecture. That vertical vendor lock, that sort of like vendor vertical, has been to say that China's leaned into it, I think is a little, I wouldn't necessarily characterize it that way, but China's ecosystem incentivizes that model, and it has turned out to be an incredibly, I think, powerful ability for Chinese domestic firms to gain international market share, especially through state subsidies, and then keep that market share as technology develops over time. Technology tends to be additive. We don't tend to rip out things. Previously, we tend to like to add and build onto them. And so Chinese firms have certainly done that. Finally, execution tempo. So when a national mission is declared, the Chinese system has been they've got this down to a well-oiled machine. It's like 30 or 40 years now since Deng Xiaoping. The subsidies, procurement guarantees, workforce mobilization. They've got the largest STEM graduate population in the world. They have incredibly dynamic research institutes, world-class universities, a thriving private capital ecosystem, an increasingly advanced manufacturing sector. So when they want to move in a direction, they can quite simply move in a direction. And another thing is they are very, 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 very concerned about establishing standards, establishing when technology is introduced. And we've seen this as a big difference between the United States. Is China's central government is extremely involved in making sure that standards are set and standards are. And we see this from their state level backing of participation in international standards bodies versus the US, where it's private sector driven. I've been, like, hey, do you want to go to this international telecom standards body work? I was like, what? I'm a policy person. Are we not sending a delegation? I've had these conversations, and we're like, oh, I think someone NTIA might go, and we go, and then there's there's 20 people sent from the China side who, had their travel paid for, versus the United States where it is private sector. It's like they will go and they will participate, and the idea of a U.S. delegation is a little bit odd. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but it was a source of frustration when I couldn't get travel funds to say, we're complaining about 5G, like losing the race in 5G, and not keeping up with the Joneses as far as international standards, and we don't have travel to send, a government policy analyst to international standards body to participate. Things like that, it tend to be a little bit frustrating. Okay, let's talk about structural limitations. Obviously, if things are okayed and allowed at the behest of a central political government, and firms are expected to be politically reliable, they are subject to those political requirements. So some of the issues we have are honest error reporting, which is as much a bug in sort of Chinese bureaucratic culture as it is, I think, maybe a commentary on the political system itself. Open peer review, there can be pressure for open peer review, especially in the behavioral social sciences, less so in the technical ones. Adversarial testing and sensitive edge cases. LLMs trained to avoid politically sensitive content may fail at open-ended reasoning tasks. Computer vision systems and policing contexts rarely get independent red teaming. AI failures in local government systems are underreported to avoid criticizing leadership. And we've seen this across, if there's a major state-level initiative, local businesses, or excuse me, local municipalities and provinces are very eager to report their successes and tend to dramatically underreport areas where they are not meeting the metric or where there have been issues. This has led to things like the real estate bubble, where you've got like shopping malls that have been developed using state-level funds that they've applied for, that have been subsidized, but have no commercial enterprises in them. They just sort of sat abandoned. They report the fact that, hey, we've implemented the state-level guidance, but they underreport the fact that there are no tenants for that building. Now that's a very different example than what we're talking about here, but and again, that isn't like, I want to be very clear, that in and of itself is not a damning indictment of that system, but it is something that does happen, and it is something that is a structural quirk, feature, bug, however you want to call it, of that level of state-directed development. Innovation path dependencies. Because funding rewards policy alignment, firms optimize for what wins grants, not necessarily for what wins globally. The market they're competing. If we view the United States or a purely market-driven innovation ecosystem, a firm is directly interacting with the market. And if a product or an innovation is good, it will sell, right? It will work, it will go out and people will buy it in droves. That is like the purest form of that. If we look in the Chinese side, what needs to happen before that is that it has to exist, and it has to be survivable in a political ecosystem. And if it cannot survive in that political ecosystem, then it's difficult for it to say that it is ever going to find space in the global market. So it's important to think that, like, firms from an innovation perspective to some degree are working through a negotiating layer, political layer, before competing in a truly global market. What this leads to is incremental improvements, giant waves of identical startups, and arguably, I think, few really paradigm-breaking research programs. I think Justin and I were talking just about this, about how, China creates an outline, it creates a framework as it understands the current state of the technology, where it needs to go. And it creates incentives to try to reach that. But that system has trouble creating things that the system itself could not conceive of. I'm sure there is a much clearer way to say that. China is not great at surprises. It's not great at creating something truly from surprise. If you look at a lot of what they've done, a lot of the things that a lot of major innovations that you've seen, and this is not to discount by the way, this is not to discount the technical ingenuity or the science that went into these innovations, or the engineering that went into these innovations. It's not to discount this at all, but a lot of them are either a derivative or an application of infrastructure. Good example, China's doing incredible things with quantum key distribution networks. They've broken through solving no cloning problem for, like, repeaters. They've solved the transmission over the air problem at night and during the day for Metius, their quantum satellite, working with Anton Zeilinger out of Austria. That really was an application. The science was there. I think what was a major sort of thing holding it back was the application of funding for development of infrastructure. Funding let me quote an Air Force study from 2012, Air Force Science Board study from 2012. The quantum key distribution fiber network is the vast expense that it would be required to retrofit or create such a network does not convey an advantage that it would ultimately solve from the application of encryption breaking quantum computing. That's since reversed course. But China took that and they started building that. They got the investment, they got state level funds to do that. And the same thing happened with Anton Zeilinger and Pan Jianwei out of Shanghai Jiaotong when they launched Mishis in 2015 or 2016. It was the intervention of Chinese funding to be able to build the satellite that allowed those teams to create some of the scientific breakthroughs. We see something like DeepSeek as well. DeepSeek wasn't a fundamental paradigm shift. It was a derivative. It was a derivative of already existing technology, a very impressive one. You do see talent friction as well. A massive talent pipeline, but you see a lot of top researchers leaving for the U.S. Now that's a little bit of a push-pull. The inconsistency, I don't have to tell anyone in this room, the inconsistency in NSF funding, federal funding for science and technology research is a constant source of friction and certainly problems for the U.S. innovation ecosystem, the U.S. research ecosystem. That is absolutely true. So it is a little bit a push-pull because from the China side, there is ample funding and frequent funding, and most importantly, consistent funding. I think last year of the Obama administration, they put out a report on quantum technologies, funding quantum technologies. And they said it was less that what they had, academics and researchers had less issue with the amounts of funding that were available and more issues with just the consistency. They wanted to know that there would be funding 5, 6 years from now, not whether you're going to have the same funding the next year. Obviously, that's a concern, but I think when you're planning out your sort of program of work, your career, the thing you're passionate about, that seems to be an issue about whether scholars stay here or don't stay here. Over-centralization risk, when the state picks winners, the system can become brittle. So if Beijing bets big on a technology paradigm that turns out wrong, the whole system may completely follow it off a cliff. I'm running short on time, I think, right? Okay. Am I over? Okay. Let me skip over to the US model, which is permissionless, chaotic, and powerful. Which I got to say is 3 really great adjectives I'm from the South, right? I'm from the middle of nowhere South, and permissionless, chaotic, and powerful just really strikes at my heart about what it means to be an American. But all jingoism aside, I really want to start here on governance. For everything that exists, everything that's created, every novel issue that exists in the world, in China, there is a law, there is a regulation. That's their way. And again, there's no criticism here. This is just a description of their system. For the U.S., the governance happens in a void. Often overlooked part of the Constitution was anything that the federal government does not explicitly authorize or regulate is left to the states. So, privacy is left to the states. Cybersecurity is left to the states. AI is left to the states. We don't have a national law that has given the government, the federal government, central authority to regulate these technologies, and they are left to the states. So the U.S.'s governance approach is therefore federated. It is federated across independent regulators who have their own buckets for industry, whether it's telecom or energy or NERC and FERC, and they have the states, and they exist in this incredible, and I mean incredible isn't a descriptive term, it is incredible fabric of sort of governance that makes it very hard to that's not a ship you can drive. That is a very messy and chaotic thing. And that's really reflective, I think, in a lot of ways in the commercial ecosystem, which works really well. I mean, it's very open, it's very federated. There's, tons of private sector dollars, open knowledge flows, capital formation and market discipline. These are all features, that enable a very dynamic ecosystem that is very, very, very good at technological surprise. It's very, very good at innovation. It is slower on market adoption, it is slower at market adoption at scale, especially when an answer has been found. You know, some of the limitations or some of the issues with this model are that liability, identifying and sort of really keying into things like liability, transparency, and regulation can slow down the model. It can slow down, if we look at this idea that technology is a prosthetic that needs to find its way to some kind of stable state, right? It's trying to reach towards something, then the fewer barriers we have for it to get to that point, the better, right? I think China would view that the technology needs to be something, let's define that what it is. I think that would strike many of us as myopic. I wanted to, you guys are obviously, or I think generally more familiar, it's like teaching an English class, I think for a lot of you, more familiar with the US system than you probably realize, so I want to make sure I give enough time for the discussion. But I did want to sort of talk about these two vastly different ecosystems, each with their own strengths, sort of side by side. So for China, strength is speed of scaling, policy, coherence, data access, sectoral integration. And you see this with their cross-sector regulatory authorities being able to do what we would call, there's a special term for this in regulatory law. I'm sure you're all familiar with it, as we all are in regulatory law. It's a sort of a two-stage regulatory model where you have a central regulator and then additional regulation sort of fills it in. For the US, it's exploration, recombination, and foundational research depth. So the Chinese system is good at being well-defined and vertically integrated applications. The US is very good at open-ended problems, paradigm shifts, and cross-domain spillovers. And we see this as just a quick pivot or a crazy eye of an application of old technologies to new problem sets. The risks or constraints for China is political distortion, path dependency, and brittleness surprises. And we see some of this in the regulation. Chinese regulation often very much focuses on the technical specifics of algorithms. How do we control algorithms? They've spent a massive amount of time, funding, research in trying to make sure that recommendation algorithms, which control content at scale, can be politically reliable. They can produce reliable effects. They're not going to do something crazy, which I think for anyone who's worked with AI knows that's a contradiction in terms. And for the US, diffusion lag, coordination failures for sure. The system is so distributed that it lacks insight, lacks left hand, the right hand, the foot don't know what the other are doing, and obviously, certainly uneven governance. I'm going to leave this slide off to sort of tee up, but I would say this: we're coming to a point where so much of China's technological and infrastructure development has used the U.S. as a benchmark, and this is in their writings from strategy to economic statecraft. They've talked about cutting around a curve from a technology development perspective. How do we get towards the U.S. and in front of the U.S. And a lot of what we know and a lot of how we define of how this works, how things can work, how things should work, how they've worked best from an innovation perspective comes from what we've seen the U.S. do. But we're coming to the part where China is very much like a technological parity, soon at economic parity. And one thing that I've seen from the last 30 years is analyst after analyst saying, based on the Washington consensus, this is how states work. This is how states work best. This is how states become technologically capable. This is how states become economically prosperous. This is how states remain stable. And China has defied those expectations every single time in a way that is is bewildering. So the question we have is, we have this idea of what an innovation ecosystem can do and the way it works best. But never underestimate the ability for China in their Byzantine planning apparatus to surprise us, to find a third way or find a different way. We cannot be closed-minded about what we think works and works best. And trying to push that in Washington can be a very difficult idea. It can be a hard thing to swallow, that US might have victory disease. You know, that the post-World War II consensus of how we view the world and how things work the best might not always be like the only practical way to do things. Human rights and other political things aside, we'll say that. Okay. So I would just leave you with that. We are coming to the place where I think those models, these models, governance systems and methods of innovation are going to be tested, and tested honestly, I think, for the first time. So I think the next 10 years is going to be particularly interesting. So with that, I would kick it over to Tomas.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me back, sort of a homecoming here to Carnegie Mellon, and thank you for joining us tonight. So the slight pivot for the rest of this talk will be on what do we actually mean when we're talking about the AI competition. When people are talking about AI and the US and China, there are many things that show up a lot, and we'll start to see that, primarily hardware. Chip exports is something that you will probably see in the news now. You will see it later tonight, and you'll probably see it tomorrow. We talk a little bit about model development publicly, but a bit less so. And I'll sort of talk a little bit about where things start to shift when we go into open models and to open connections, and how that maybe is at odds when we have very thriving research communities in both countries, and very thriving research communities that depend on one another and that now have to sort of reconcile their intellectual exchanges with policy decisions. And then the final one, the sort of universal challenge for everyone, model integration. Actually being able to use what you've built. And that will be sort of the fun stuff towards the end there. So AI hardware tends to break down into two topics. You have your GPUs, which everyone is talking about right now. Think NVIDIA, AMD sometimes. And then you have your central processing units, which think Intel and other companies, TSMC, making almost all of these. And we're in a pretty unique situation where a lot of these are companies that are not quite based in the US, but they have major ownership in the US. They are run in some ways by US policy, even though there is supposedly a free and fair market that's deciding who can be a customer and who cannot. And now there's a decision on whether or not they can be exported to some degree elsewhere. So what happens when we potentially stunt growth by limiting hardware? That's the goal, right? Is to say, okay, one way that we can adjust the competition is to limit who gets the hardware that can actually train these models, that can run these models at scale. But primarily, these are framed for national security measures, that if the military has access to these hardware capabilities, they will be able to increase surveillance, have advanced intelligence models for prediction and outcomes and things like that. But it's kind of a double-edged sword. So there have been a lot of work by the ITIF, who have actually done a quite detailed study into the finances of this, that limiting the ability to export things limits the amount of jobs being created, limits the amount of money on the table for a lot of these companies. Yes, it does position you in a strategic thing, but what happens then when international firms begin to fill the gap? So if NVIDIA is not making those sales, the next biggest players, we have South Korea, is one of the largest GPU makers nowadays. We then also have firms across the EU, predominantly in the Netherlands. We have firms in Japan. And while they are in some ways influenced by these export controls, they are also a lot better positioned to fill in that gap because they have the capabilities. China is also very quick to fill that gap when it comes to hardware. And that's one of the other trade-offs and the danger that people have often debated. So when the US is no longer providing that hardware, China has very quickly done investment and shifts. As John mentioned, they have that capability to very quickly scale things up in particularly for what is known as a good enough solution. Being able to create many, many chips that are then designed in a clever way, hooked up together to still get the compute resources that you need, that's essentially equivalent to one very large and very powerful NVIDIA chip. They've already figured that out. There's a really great paper that released earlier. I think I sent it to you, John, a few weeks ago, on that, about this ability to hook up multiple chips and get far more compute out of it than had previously been expected. This ability to work in resource-constrained environments is something that is incredibly advantageous, especially around this time period when we are looking at what is the best technical approach. And we have seen the good enough strategy work before. When the US restricted imports for electric Chinese cars, BYD was still sort of considered kind of the good enough option. And now it is an internationally dominant electric car chain that is rivaling Tesla in most international markets outside of the US. We are very likely going to see a similar thing with these chips, because if Huawei has no problem being able to ship those chips internationally, if I can get a relatively cheap, very pretty good chip into my gaming PC, for example, they now have my $200 that NVIDIA doesn't have. And very soon, good enough becomes very, very good. And we're starting to see similar aspects within the software as well. And that's where we're going to move a little bit to AI model development. This is less talked about than the chip exports in the news. It was spoken about very recently, or most dramatically, around the release of DeepSeek and the resulting market crash in many of the AI companies. This idea that now there's a Sputnik moment where a model was released that can compete with OpenAI and all of these major US firms at a portion of the cost and at a portion of the compute capability, and it's being released open source, meaning anyone can access it, anyone can download it, and you don't need to pay a monthly fee, and you don't need any of those things. So in order to get there, what do you actually need? Well, the recipe for AI is relatively straightforward, but with lots of caveats as these suddenly become problems for humans to solve. You need a lot of machine-readable data. You need it digitized. You need a storage capacity for that data. Just think data centers, large server farms. From there, you have to have training over many iterations. Essentially, you are splitting this massive amount of data into multiple test cases, multiple training cases, and running through all of those for what you hope will be an optimized solution to whatever problem it is that you're solving with that data. Evaluation metrics, then, to measure how well did this actually do. For that, you need a well-documented ground truth. You need a well-documented understanding of what it is actually that you're trying to achieve, and how does that performance usually get marked, generally by a human. How has a human previously done that task? How well did they perform on a legal task, for example? Therefore, how well does Harvey, our legal AI, have to perform on that type of task? And then the final part is motivated use case. We'll get into that in a moment. That's the adaptation part. The how do you actually integrate this? That's where the fun challenge lies. But when we talk about model development, what's the US landscape look like? It's foundation model first. It's incredibly dominated by market dynamics. It's incredibly marketed by a need for a general model. We had this exciting spark of AGI is possible suddenly. And that's kind of driven us a lot of the way, using very large models built on incredibly wide swaths of data that have been more or less taken from anywhere, whether that's through legal means or less legal means, to be debated in various court cases around the world. And this idea that a bigger and better model exists and that we can outcompete one another towards building one of those. And we start to see that consolidate around a few companies. We start to see those decisions being made at that high level, and very little of it is being handed out in terms of, we have a few open models from research, and by open you have two levels. You have open weight, which is what you're seeing on something like an Ollama platform. These are the open release versions of the Llama models. You're not getting access to the data set when you download one of those, but you are getting all of the parameters that have defined that model. You are getting all of the information that essentially tells this language model to work in this particular way. Then you have a few research institutions that have gone even further. They've gone a full open source model. So that's one thing to highlight here. Most often when you hear an open source model, it's actually most likely an open weight model. they're very rarely releasing the training data set that they use to build that model. Almost always that is a proprietary thing that Meta or whoever is still holding on to. There are a few research ones that are completely open source, but that's a lot harder. You need more access to data. You also need to be able to download and store that data. Not everyone has that, so making a fully open source model is not necessarily the most appropriate response to getting those into the hands of users, but open weight models do offer quite a lot of capability for people. Another thing that we see here is very, very much focused on billions of dollars of compute, focused on a few companies that are able to hyperscale. And we're seeing this sort of cyclical process where Microsoft is paying NVIDIA, NVIDIA is paying Oracle, Oracle is paying Microsoft, and so forth. It's a very close alignment and an interesting sort of caveat to what the keynote here for our talk is of democratic values. How much of that is being reflected in private companies that are not necessarily democratically elected in their business plans or their models, and their resource distribution is also completely decided by themselves and their stakeholders, whoever those might be. But it does reinforce this idea of a winner-take-most dynamic, this idea that whoever is able to create, at the moment, the biggest, most intelligent model that is reflective will dominate the market share, and therefore, in response, set the standards of what does it mean to have a good model? What does it mean to be outperforming? That will likely take time, as John indicated previously. It's not driven by a particular mission or goal in mind right now. It's driven by we need as many users using this model as much as possible, while balancing how much energy our data centers are consuming and whether or not we can still run this affordably for long term. When we then look a little bit towards the Chinese landscape for AI models, we have a very strong regulatory environment shaping where things are being invested, where energy is being focused in terms of building these models. They need to follow certain standards before they can even be released. But once they are released, they are very much integrated into all of the potential marketplaces where they're being released. One alignment with that is what we saw with open models, this idea that you don't necessarily need to pay a monthly fee in order to use DeepSeek. You can pretty easily find it on Ollama. You can find it on multiple places to download it. And since then, Quan models have been released in droves. And what they've also done is they've released focused versions. There is Quan Coder, that focuses primarily on coding tasks and things like that. Another one that they have is a vision language model focusing on multimodal capabilities where it can look at both images as well as language. And these are small, lightweight, and they can go onto your device. They don't necessarily have to be connected to the internet once they are on your device, meaning you can access that model from anywhere at any time without having to constantly log into your ChatGPT or download the ChatGPT app or pay however much. Sure, you lose some of the power and capability at times, right? You are dealing with a slightly different sized model. You're also dealing with a slightly different amount of compute resources. But for most general everyday tasks, just to have a chat buddy, just to ask a few questions, maybe plan through a document, you don't necessarily need the entire weight of Microsoft behind you for every single everyday task. So there is a very powerful ability to release these types of things. But what we're seeing here is a conflict of a need for international dominance of models, a navigation of politics and policy. But at the same time, you have researchers who are driving this open source space, this open weight space, through collaborative work. They are citing one another. The incredible amount of research paperwork being created by research institutes across both the US and China is incredibly interconnected. The amount of citations being passed back and forth is in some ways and strangely at odds with what we are talking about when it comes to a policy space and when it comes to some of these items. So applied research being such a focused tool for getting things done, for driving international factors, relies so heavily on the advancement of completely open research, things that we are doing at universities like this, that by nature should be open to anyone, by nature should be collaborative. And this is one of the twists and spins that perhaps we can talk about when we talk about this AI competition is at the moment it's sort of who gets to decide the terms of this competition, because in order for any of it to work, we are relying on work that has been a collaborative effort from the beginning. AI has been around for 60 years. We are right now talking about foundation models that are the hot new thing at the moment, but they are built on mathematics papers, statistics papers, going back for so many years that are completely an international effort that have not necessarily been restricted or defined by border policies and export controls, for example. And as we move into areas where you can now say, help me set up an open source model on my device, you no longer necessarily need to be paying into the market dynamics. How is our world going to adjust, a predominantly market-driven world, going to adjust when the technical barrier to entry, to open tools, to open technology, is rapidly decreasing, when I can spend 20 minutes with a proprietary ChatGPT model that can give me instructions for how to download Ollama, set up my own local model, and suddenly I'm no longer an OpenAI customer. If I need any more help, I can continue to iterate and work with that model. I can use the free version until I have a completely, essentially my own software stack set up at home. How is that going to change the way our models exist going forward? And how are we going to use them? So this is what happens next. We have the technology. We know that it can improve our capability. We know that it can expand the opportunities of what is possible. But being actually able to use the technology, that's where we have a real impact on society, where we have a real impact on the type of work that we do. And here we get this point where governments in both countries are incredible funders of this type of work. We've seen this with China's direct approach through their involvement in tech company leadership, the process, the stack that John outlined for us just shortly ago. And the US has also traditionally used subsidies, contracts, and incentives. We've also seen that start to change with partial ownership over Intel and other companies like that. We're getting pretty close to that stack that John just outlined if we are keeping track of the documents recently. But that's been quite impressive in the past because we've seen things where this has gone very well with particle colliders, early setup of internet. These are both government contracts that have been set out, but they are a partnership very closely with research institutions. Where we get into some trouble is when the government also acts as a customer. They have to articulate their needs. Not only is that very difficult because these are large-scale entities, but governments have also existed a lot longer than most internet users have existed. That means a lot of their data is not fully digitized. It also means that their data is not always accessible. Sometimes some of it is more secure than others. Some of it is more sensitive than others. Some of it is not even digitized to begin with. And it's not necessarily well formatted. The person who was in the records room years ago may or may not still be there and can tell you where to find certain things. How are you going to get that into a model is going to take quite a bit of effort and quite a bit of time. Another thing is we have point of contact difficulties. And this is an aspect that we are running into as well in some of our work. With the SCI, right? We have a point of contact. Administrations change. That point of contact moves out. They get promoted. They move on to a new command somewhere else. And similarly, China has recently had a few announcements around changes within their military leadership, for example. If you are a tech company that has been closely working with a commander of some type, and they are now being cycled out, whether in the US or China, who's going to carry on that project? Is that government partner still a customer? How is that tool now going to get integrated into this ongoing competition we are hearing more and more about if there's no one to run point? We've built the technology, but where are we putting it now? And a lot of the myths and narratives sort of tend to be a challenge. Often we find ourselves having to be translators in rooms like this, where we say, yes, here are the actual capabilities of the AI system. Here is your actual need. How do we make sure that those align? How do we make sure that your expectation when we say AI is more than just an LLM? Because again, AI has many, many years of history. Many, many mathematical models have existed for a very long time that have been called AI historically. How do we make sure that those are not forgotten when we have this type of conversation? And how do we navigate those types of things? And this is sort of where the fun starts to happen. AI development is iterative. It is a challenge. It is ongoing. And this is where partnerships like this between Software Engineering Institute, CMIST, is an opportunity to level out that type of language, where we are able to say, what data do we have? What problem are we trying to solve? and what models are available to us. And the more we are able to navigate those types of conversations from both the technical side but also the policy side, the more likely we are to getting a resolution to this type of competition. Because both sides struggle with this. I mean, this is the challenge on all of the items. And if we want a fun little example of one to talk about as we move towards the discussion, is to look towards communication protocols. As we move towards applied AI, we have agents that have to communicate with one another. In the news, you might hear about agent to agent by Google or MCP by Anthropic. These are some standards that dictate how an agent can interact with tools and do a bunch of functions on behalf of a human. But those aren't standards that are widely accepted across all agents that are used by all technology companies. Is the US going to set those up in the current regulatory space? We don't know. Is the EU perhaps? They did set up GDPR, and most US tech companies have to follow GDPR to some extent if they want access to that audience. China seems to be quite good at setting up standards that are being followed through all the way through. So is that perhaps one of the areas that we need to look into? With that, thank you very much. If you want to contact me, Andrew ID is there. You can scan that as well. Thank you.
We're going to reset the stage here in just a second, and I'll provide a couple of brief questions, but we'll quickly transition to audience questions. So start thinking about those right now. All right, thank you both for really great presentations. I'd like to set conditions for the first question by referring to they're not too old at this point. National Security Commission on AI's findings, around the 2019, 2020 timeframe, that said that the competition in AI between the U.S. and China was close, a close thing, but the U.S. was slightly edging it out. So given the comparison that you made for us, John, and what appears to be, and forgive me if I mischaracterize your position, Tomas, his now maybe awarding the edge to China, do you buy into that narrative, the growing narrative that China already has emerged as the dominant AI developer powerhouse, in the world?
Mm-hmm.
John?
No, not remotely. Next question. No, maybe not remotely, is overstating the case a little bit. The power and preeminence of U.S. tech companies is the numbers that we're talking about for global market share for U.S. tech companies from like 2000 to just recently are mind-boggling. Right, and so the fact that Chinese companies have been able to make gains, especially in the global South, especially in developing countries, I mean, sure, they've made some gains, they've eaten into market share, but when you look at like markets, like we know that the application of AI, the application and selling AI and generating money for AI, money that's going to go back into, that's going to be reinvested in, that's going to because that is so business and market driven, all of these companies, their global market share is a ratchet for the application and sale of that technology. And U.S. market dominance in the tech space is just so huge. Also, as far as, I think it's called, what is it called? Information privacy capitalism. Like the U.S. is, a lot of our tech company markets, they can take much bigger risk from innovation space because so much of their market model is based off of selling our personal data, right? And so in a permissive environment where there's less constraints about collecting that data and selling it and reselling it, they have a massive engine of growth that is not beholden to market dynamics, where they can take riskier investments and they can shunt like earnings over into capitalizing on the next big thing. I would say the United States is still as dynamic as it ever was from an education perspective. Capital markets and private sector capital can be short-sighted, I think, but I think they're trying to learn to change that. But I think that level of tech dominance, to wrap this up, is so large and is so profound at the start of this race that even the gains that China has made, like the United States, I think still has a pretty massive edge just by virtue of the strength of its companies.
Yeah, I would agree. I think one of the messages I was trying to convey in the compare and contrast throughout my presentation is that they are not fully exclusive, right? The technology has crossed borders. The technology is advancing in an interrelated fashion. And when we make an advancement, they learn from that. We often are making advancements at a scale, like John just pointed out, that far outcompetes anyone in the world. One of the things that we can learn from is doing the same thing, because very often they are also making an advancement under constraints that the US is not under, but that would be strategically intelligent for us to be aware of. How are they able to make a comparative model at scale with fewer compute resources and less incentive and less investment than we were able to? And this was something that I didn't quite get to fit into the slides, but we saw this a little bit if you look at other industries, right? Because we have such powerful computers nowadays, we often have developers using, let's say, less than efficient code because they can make up for it with this incredibly powerful computer. You could get so much more out of that incredibly powerful computer if you wrote particularly efficient code, really knew how the hardware works, really know how assembly code works, and are really taking that time. But we don't need to. We have thousands of cores running all the time. So things like that is, we can still learn even if we are dominating the markets. We can still learn even if we are dominating the technology sphere.
Yeah, I mean, I'll piggyback. Like, I think this is an important point to make. There is a major difference between doing something crazy when you know it's possible than doing something crazy when you have no idea. If the U.S. has used vast amounts of resources, burned billions, to do something in an exquisite way and shown that it is possible, it's not crazy for you to say, I know that's possible. How did they do it? I know I can, and now I know that there is an optimized way I can do it with 3 Legos and a brick.
Yeah.
And China has time and time and time again proven. It reminds me of the old Soviet thing where, like, the United States, like the old Soviet example, and I'm sure this is apocryphal. The United States NASA spent billions of dollars having a pen that could write upside down in space, and the Soviet was like, "We'll use a pencil." You know what I mean? and it's a similar sort of thing. Like there's that. Well, they're less advanced, but like, man, they have that can-do attitude and can do it. But China has shown like they can do that. They are the commodity chip maker, right? So like they can build and do these things at scale. We've seen this with parallel computing, right? Like where even their homegrown chip, the Shunwei series of chips, like out of Wuxi, Wuxi has now created this massive supercomputing center because they can make these like traditional commodity chips and then net them together into these like exascale, petascale, I'm sure I'm getting that wrong, some scale computers that are incredibly advanced. But I would say, like, it's like the 5-minute mile thing, or the first dude who ran the 5-minute mile was like hungover, did it accidentally, and no one had ever done it before. And then after that, like people started doing it regularly because they're like, oh, you can do it.
It's doable.
Like I just have to gut it out the last 10 minutes, or the last minute or something.
So then, how will we know if we're being overtaken? Either one of you.
Please go ahead. That's a hard question.
That is a very hard question. I think we will know when essentially we find ourselves scrambling in a similar situation of they've done something we had no idea was possible. how do we do that? And how do we do that with what we have currently? And that will also possibly what we'll see is a shift in terms of where things are being written about when it comes to AI research. Dominant language still in STEM is English. China has made quite a bit of a focus in humanities, social sciences to write as many papers also in traditional Chinese or Mandarin. And in tech, maybe they're getting to 25% of those papers are also in that language. But for the most part, it's still dominant in English. If that starts to change, maybe that's 75%, then we start to see, okay, there is more being made of really novel research that we are going to have to work a little bit harder to sort of complicate and replicate to some extent.
I think it's easy to forget about this. In 1800, the two largest economies in the world were China and India. They had 200. They had a rough 150 years. China is a country of 1.4 billion people. If we assume that there is an average rate of people who are STEM graduates, and those STEM graduates, there's an average rate of them who are groundbreaking geniuses, that China is punching well below its weight. And we have to reconcile ourselves with the fact that if China's development goals are realized, and by all accounts they seem to be on track, even if underreported, that they are going to continue to gain in increasing the STEM capacity, increasing industrial capacity, increasing economic growth, increasing creation of intellectual property. And if it ever accords commensurate with their size and population, then they are going to punch at a weight larger than the United States, and that there's nothing wrong with that. The thing that I'm looking at is from a production productivity perspective. As long as like the national champions are still exist in a contentious global market, theirs and ours, then I think we will always, there is never going to be a pure out and out winner, right? And I don't think either country is going to allow, Microsoft or portions of it to be sold off to a Chinese firm or Huawei to be sold off to a US firm. But if either of the countries loses or is diminished in those national champions, which is the engine and source of growth for technological development and the outlet for technology development, then that is an indicator that we're being edged out. They're indicating that the economics of what we're doing isn't working anymore. But I do think from a competition perspective, and I know it is heresy to say this, I think we do need to, if China continues the way it's going, I think we have to recognize the scale of what they are building. If they are successful, it is going to look like, the majority of AI papers in Chinese. We shouldn't fear that, because that means that they are, developing their STEM capital to where it historically should be.
If he pulls out a historical reference, I might add one as well, right? We see the intellectual capitals of the world also shifting throughout history. We had, until more or less the 1800s, Paris was the place where Americans went to go and study medicine, art, culture, things like that. We had Germany for a long time as the science center. Most things were, up until the World Wars, most science papers were predominantly written in German, and then that shifted as well, right? So that could be another indicator, right? Is where is the brain drain going? Where are fully international communities of people from all over the world going to study, to work, to write papers, to engage in dialogue, to have these types of open research conversations? And if those capitals start to shift, that can be another sign. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's unprecedented. I think it's unprecedented in human history that we're entering a era where we are entering a truly multipolar world order, the one where stability is backed by, nuclear weapons and trade, where there's no war, and there's no expectation of war. There's competition, things are boiling over, I don't like him, But that is bizarre, and what it means is the last 80 years of geopolitics, the lessons we've learned from the monopolar moment, the bipolar, U.S.-Soviet thing, they're applicable in some degree, but it feels like the rules are being rewritten. That's just, back over to you.
So,
Cheery thought.
we're going to open it up now to questions from our participants here in the audience. Please try to, in the interest of time, please try to be quick about getting to your question. And we'll try to get to as many as we can with the time that we have left, right here in the second row. We'll wait for the microphone, please. There we go. Thanks.
Hi. So one of the things that the American government tries to do is to push the transition of innovation from research to into practice, into economic practice. They're the technology readiness levels. And there's been bipartisan support to create, through the Commerce Department, manufacturing innovation institutes to usher that TRL maturation from 4 to 7. Which is when industrial R&D takes on technology. Does China have that problem, or is it or are they able to avoid it because the government is managing the technology maturation within the companies?
That is an incredibly specific and insightful question. That's a really good question. I think to some degree they are managing technological maturation within companies. I think it gets into a little bit of a gray area. I think sometimes from a research perspective, given a lot of, not a lot, but there's a certain element of research that is collaborative in these cases. I mean, I wouldn't go so far to say I don't think sort of like the government's sort of like the U.S. government's sort of schema of like TRL levels or TRLs. It's like saying cat card, right? Like TRL levels are applicable. I don't think it's certainly a way to look at it, but I don't think they look at it in the same way. It's sort of that is a very inside baseball question, and a very astute one. So that was a hard one.
I mean, that I feel like was the best one can answer for that one. But I would say that when we see innovation being directed by governments, getting things. I forget who said this at one point, but someone balanced it between a government is very good at helping you get to something that can be considered a $1 trillion idea. It's not that good at getting you to sort of $1 million or $1 billion idea, right? So the government helps you get to the internet. It doesn't necessarily help you get to the iPhone. And I'm very curious to see how that plays out in a very different government type structure. And I think that is something that China is navigating as we speak, and we get to learn from that. We get to see how that works. But I don't know if that's necessarily something that the US is very fast to fit into its own workflow yet.
Okay, let's go red sweater right there in the back.
Thank you. So the U.S. Private tech space has been sort of talking about pursuing AGI and these sort of sci-fi-esque visions of the future of AI. So, for example, there's been some talk about moving away from language models to world models and so on. So how is that similar or different to China's vision for the future of AI, and also what's happening in Washington, D.C.? And as also a follow-up, do you see China pursuing these threads of innovation like world models that haven't necessarily come to fruition yet?
You gonna take this first? You? I got you. I got the last one first. You take it.
Yes, that is something that I think we're going to see challenged more and more. AGI was a very attractive topic to push, and it's one that gets a lot of eyes on the problem of AI. It also gets a lot of investment into companies through boardroom meetings. It is, even in the US tech space, while still very much on the board, we are starting to encounter more and more customers who are interested in, I need a specific model that can solve a specific problem, and I like the fact that it can talk to me in my own language, and I don't need to be a tech expert that knows how to navigate a terminal and knows how to understand a bunch of mathematical calculations. And in many cases, the solution is not to have AGI, but actually to have a really, really thorough, specifically targeted agent model of some kind. And that's very likely where we're going to see immediate short-term shift of attention towards these types of agent things. And I believe I spoke earlier that I don't think necessarily that China has the same ambition for an AGI model. I don't think they're interested in having a model that is able to sort of have these general thoughts about the world. I think they're really looking for something that will get the job done, something that will integrate efficiently. And you asked sort of follow-up around Washington. We kind of saw from open releases from the DoD, DOW now, they do seem to care. They want quote-unquote lethality, quote-unquote killer robots. They don't necessarily want AGI there either. They don't want something that has existential crises or has conflicts of interest or consciousness around it. So in terms of that, a focus is probably not, at least within this administration, for a free-thinking computer system. It might still be an interest to the Silicon Valley corner of people who believe very much in that philosophy of the super intelligence and that as the ideal transfer for humanity in future steps, but not the short-term focus anymore, I would say.
Nothing you said was wrong. That's just terrible. No, like
Thank you.
there's no, that was
No.
it was really good. I just add on a few things. AGI is attractive because, I don't have to tell you guys, but from an economics perspective, as soon as AGI is achieved, the market value of a lot of other technologies drops immediately to zero, right? Like it's a singularity, right? The Chinese view AI and its sort of like quintessential essence, AGI, in a lot of the same ways they view like internet technologies. They see the market potential. They see it as major engines of growth. They see all that. They also see it as a fundamental threat to stability. It is because from the Chinese perspective, everything, all elements of human activity must be subject to governance. The US persisted with this idea of the internet as a sort of a sui generis, ungoverned space. And that's true, but that does not by governments, but there is governance. And obviously China took a different view, this sort of cyber sovereignty, one that I think has become the de facto norm across the world, which is the internet needs to be subject to human governance. I think they view AI the same way, and I think their experience with something as simple as recommendation algorithms has proven that the technology is strikingly difficult to control and manipulate on a level that is predictable, while still gaining the economic advantages that it promises. And I would have to assume that is even more compounded with the complexity of AGI, whatever the heck that looks like at the end of the day. And on the U.S. side, it reminds me of Ian Malcolm in Jurassic Park. You were so busy worrying about whether you could, you didn't think about whether you should. There's a lot of virtue to that, but it is scary. The U.S. is a leap before you look. The instances where we have empowered the federal government with large-scale authority to govern a massive human activity has not occurred since the 1920s with the creation of some of the independent agencies. That isn't going to change. So, what does governance look like when when Congress is like, we're not passing any new laws on this? That's hard. And certainly less of a policy problem than a political one. But I digress.
Right there in the gray shirt.
Good evening. I'm Charlie. Currently a graduate student studying information technology strategy. Mr. Costello, you mentioned that you received backlash in different atmospheres in DC for mentioning or acknowledging that there's a growing Chinese dominance. Do you think that in DC there may be some sort of status-seeking theory that could be influencing our country to have some sort of blinders associated with Chinese dominance? And if so, do you see any repercussions by not really acknowledging or normalizing these conversations culturally?
It's a good question. That's part of a little bit of a longer discussion. Congress is the great cage match of democracy, intentionally. Like, it is ugly and it is bloody and it is public. It was designed that way, which is mind-blowing. Like, a dude was beating another dude in the 1800s on the floor of the Senate, right? People are like, politics are bad. I'm like, they've been worse, right? The reason why I say that is, let's separate the talking points from what people are saying in the room, right? Like, what people are saying, the currency they're walking around. The problem is having a conversation and correctly characterizing the strength of the Chinese system, the strengths that they have, and the U.S.'s ability to meet that without tipping over into abject fear, without tipping over into it should be or shouldn't be, but rather a sobering and matter-of-fact acknowledgement of fact and what the U.S. can do. And a lot of times, and also correctly diagnosing the issue. If China is living up to its potential, its full industrial might, its human capital might, in every way that the U.S. has, or similar ways, then their economy is going to be bigger than ours. The stuff they produce is going to be more. They are going to, they're going to innovate. And the U.S. fighting that is like fighting gravity. You shouldn't, right? Flap harder, put on a more powerful jetpack, right? And so, having some of these conversations, and that's the struggle, is diagnosing the problem and making sure, and getting into, this is going to be a crazy thing to say, but nuance is not the language of American politics, but it really needs to be the language of American policy. And when you get into the room, having that level of nuance, correctly diagnosing the problem, and trying to separate the fear. The United States, most of the policymakers, have always lived in a world where the United States was the unparalleled best country, right? Best economy, best technology, best military, best colleges, best universities, best national parks, still are, by the way. This idea that someone is beating us without playing by the rules of the game is threatening. It's upsetting. And sometimes you have to take and set that apart and say, I don't know why it works, but it works. And that's a reality that we have to accord and we have to contend with, or we can disregard it at our own peril. And so, separating that fear is some of the challenge at DC. I didn't say backlash, by the way. I was just saying sometimes it's not a popular thing to sort of acknowledge in a mixed environment in a DC kegger, as they say. So or a happy hour. So. I'm kidding.
Tomas, would you like to add anything to that?
They don't let me out of the room, I'm an academic, so our things are all about the very kumbaya collaboration research. But I can understand what John is saying. But just as much as you have to be nuanced about where you're making your policy decisions, maybe sort of more as a research scientist, as an engineer, my mind goes to, what can I learn? What can I exchange? What is in that system that works, and not just stop at, we don't know why it works, but we should be aware of it, but actually, let's take a look at that. What can we learn about that? How can we bring something of that here and go from there? And how can that actually improve people's lives, if possible? But yeah, that's also why they keep me in doing the research, not in the policy rooms.
Well, I want to thank you both for a great discussion tonight, and thank you for answering so many of our questions. We are unfortunately at the end of our event. I'd like to offer you, please, and ask you to accept these imprinted notebooks, CMIS imprinted notebooks
very
as a
cool.
token of our appreciation.
Awesome.
Thank you.
And on behalf of our
moleskin.
director,
Look at
Professor Cronin, I want to thank all of you for joining us tonight and for your questions and your attention. Thank you, and have a great evening.